The virtual CISO moment is brought to you by vCISO Services, a leading provider of quality and experienced virtual chief information security officers for small and mid-sized businesses. Check them out at vcisoservices.com. Hi, I'm Greg Schaefer, and welcome to the Virtual CISO Moment. We've got Derek Andrews joining us today. He is an incident response manager at a financial institution and resident Birdman of LinkedIn. Derek, how are you doing this morning?
Great, great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking a few minutes to join us. We'd love to hear your IT and cyber path, starting from why did you get into this field, which can be so crazy, and how did you get to where you're at right now as far as incident response?
Some of it was planned, and some was kind of accidental. I saw War Games in 1983. I thought, hey, that's really cool. And at the time, I was a kid who had a computer. I had a Commodore 64 and 300 baud modem. And I grew up in a home where I had a parent who was at that time kind of in IT. It was an IT auditor, much different form of IT than what we see today.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of had a lot of encouragement there, and I realized that this was something that you could do as a career. But at that time, and even in through the 90s, there were really very few places that were hiring cybersecurity people. It wasn't the field that's anywhere near it is today.
Mm-mm.
So
Yeah.
I kind of started like many others. I started in general IT, taking on whatever tasks I was asked. I was doing things at the elbow. I was doing things on the network. I was managing projects. And then I got to move into a dedicated cybersecurity role, probably 13 years ago. And at that point, it was a maturing field, and I was working for a consulting firm. And then I had the chance to consulting's great until it's not. And then I had the chance to kind of sleep in the same bed every night, and was able to go to work for a healthcare system where we really grew and built a program, and it was a dedicated cybersecurity role.
And so now that led you to focusing on incident response. Is that like a passion of yours, or just a sidestep for now?
I don't know that it's a sidestep. Is that my first full time job was not in IT. It was actually I started down the path in the criminal justice world,
Mm-hmm.
and quickly realized that I don't like this. There are a lot of really fun things about this, but there are also a lot of really bad things about this. And incident response, if you are somebody who is geared towards the fight versus the flight in the response, you'll probably make a good incident responder. And that was just the way I was. Is that when things were going wrong, I wasn't the one who turned around and ran from them. And even through IT, when others said, "Oh, that looks like that's going to get bad. I'm getting out of here and going to lunch," I stuck around because I knew there's going to be people needed and things that need to be done. So I think it was just kind of a natural movement towards that.
Well, I know that well, you mentioned that you've actually been in several verticals, several industries, and I know from my experience in the financial services realm, I was a bank CISO before starting the independent route of the virtual CISO world 5.5 years ago, and still keep my hands in that, working for a couple of FIs, credit unions and banks right now. Um, Incident response in some ways can be the same based on verticals, or it can be a little bit different. What challenges would you say that you see specifically with regards to incident response, specifically in the financial institution?
It's the regulatory environment. If you look at healthcare versus financial, each one has different metrics as to what an incident is versus what it isn't. And then if you do have an incident, you're on a ticking clock in some cases for reporting. So, for instance, healthcare, misdirected faxes in healthcare can be considered an incident because that is a breach per HIPAA. Now, how many determines how big it is, but you're on a ticking clock for reporting that and doing the discovery and the cleanup. Financial is the same way, is that you have certain metrics that need to be hit when you have an incident or what an incident even is. So learning the regulatory environment is always fun. It's kind of the first thing that I do coming into any new vertical is what's the regulatory environment? What do I need to know?
Well, certainly those are two of the most highest regulated environments out there. Although certainly we're seeing an increase now in the DIB space with regards to CMMC and all that as well too. So, what just in general, what would you say is the most significant threat to small and mid-sized businesses? The reason why I ask this is that a lot of the folks that listen to this are either they're cybersecurity folks that work in small and mid-sized businesses, or they are business leaders in there. They're their CFOs or the CEOs, and they're always like bombarded with like, what is the greatest threat? They're not sure where to pivot. So I always ask folks to what their opinion is on what is the greatest threat in your mind, in your eyes, cybersecurity for small and mid-sized businesses at this moment today.
I think the big worry there is you're an SMB and you're trying to do the right things and you're buying those products that are in the top right of the square. But a lot of times the time that is needed to actually configure them and monitor them isn't there. So products are being bought to fill the gap, but in some cases they're kind of sitting stale and static from the day they were put in. And I think as an SMB, you got to lean on your teams more and say, are these tools configured correctly for today's threats, not the threats from a year ago when we bought this? And do we have the ability to quickly adapt to tomorrow's threat with this tool? And then looking across the MITRE framework and saying, let's look at our entire tool set and where do we have coverage and where do we have gaps? Where do we have overlap? Because operational expenditure is not unlimited in an SMB, and it's expensive. And you've got to get your money's worth out of those tools and making sure you have people that know how to operate them.
Well, I'm glad you went down that path, because that was exactly what I was thinking about: the tool inventory, the tool overlap, the propensity sometimes to just buy a tool because you see that it's in the upper right quadrant of Gartner or whatever. In other words, that there's been some sort of vetting in some ways. Maybe it's more played or pay to play, but at the very least, you start out by addressing the problem with what you think is the right tool, but then you just sort of end it there. And I would think that in a lot of ways falls on the shoulders of the chief information security officer. Would you think that there's like a disconnect there?
Yeah, I think there is that we often joke on LinkedIn about checkbox compliance of, well, I bought the right stuff, I checked the boxes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one of my kind of side hobbies is woodworking, and I could go out and outfit my shop with the finest Festool stuff I could get. It doesn't mean that my woodworking is going to get any better. I'm limited by my skill and ability, not the tools. So I really think looking at your people and saying, do we have the right people to operate this stuff? Just buying it isn't enough. And if we buy the greatest product there is without the people to operate it, is it actually going to do anything for us?
And then
And
that's, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say that kind of pivots to particularly on the smaller side of the SMBs, where you don't actually have that CISO leadership in place, and so they'll turn to the virtual CISO realm to potentially lead that. And I'm going to pivot a little bit more on that now, because that was actually one of the reasons why we first started discussing coming on the podcast, because you had mentioned something along the lines of that you've seen virtual CISOs that, and I'm not even paraphrasing you, I'm using my own words, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it's more along the lines of like, they're kind of like vCISO in name only. They don't really have the experience of cyber or IT, and they're more your traditional consultant that's really just focused on billable time and not actually being effective. I totally agree with a lot of that. And one of my soapbox topics, if you will, is I hate to see when folks go out there and put the vCISO tag on their LinkedIn profile, and yet they're not able to provide that that experience for businesses. So can you kind of walk me down a little bit more about some specifics that you've seen in the virtual CISO world, both the pros and the cons? And if there's more cons, then that's fine as well too, because I definitely want to try to help people understand that this isn't an end all do all solution for small and mid-sized businesses if they're not getting the right people to do the leadership, to help with like the tool overlap and all of that.
Yeah, having worked at a VAR, the value-added reseller, I think the VARs a few years ago realized that there is a shortage of cyber leadership and cyber strategy, even among CIOs who were having to struggle to figure out what cyber threats are and what they needed. So the VARs quickly started spinning up these vCISO practices, and they took one of their consultants who's never built a program and never led a program. Maybe it's even a salesperson functioning as a vCISO, and they sell the service as, hey, we have this service, we'll help you plan and we'll help get the right things in place, although they've never actually done it before. But they're selling that idea. And what the VARs were really doing was getting somebody on the inside who then became an inside salesperson, truly inside your organization, who got access to all your network diagrams, who got access to your budget, knew all your plans. And while they're telling you what you should be doing, they're also at the same time presenting you a statement of work for them to do it as additional revenue. And it became a massive revenue stream for them. And highlighting one of the ones I've seen is that she lists herself as a vCISO, but 2 years ago she was selling insurance, and a year before that she was working totally nowhere near like talking like being a cashier at a convenience store kind of work, like not in an IT capacity or an office capacity at all. And
So, yeah, and I hate to hear those stories because I mean, you pivot to someone like me. The main reason why I got into this was to take my experience that I've had over the years and help small and mid-sized businesses. So, and this is not about me, but just a snippet of that side is I was applying more than 25 years of experience, of progressive experience in IT and information security, including 10 at the CISO level by the time that I started to go down this road. And you brought up a really good point that I didn't really think about, that inside sales, where they're working for an MSP that provides the solutions, if you will, that we were just talking about before. We have sometimes you have overlap, sometimes you have gaps, and you really need to work on that solution inventory. And to me, that sounds like that you're kind of crossing conflict of interest. Is that what you were getting at with regards to that sometimes?
yeah, certainly it's are you there to do the best for the organization that is hiring you, or are you there doing the best for the organization who's employing you? Because if your bonus structure is based upon the number of sales you get signed, you have a really good incentive to get as much signed at the organization, whether it benefits them long term or not, it doesn't matter. You're getting paid on it. And that's the thing that worries me most, especially with any outsourced resource.
And then it's kind of compounded by what you were saying before, is where businesses, I think this was the risk you were talking about, businesses will buy tools but not necessarily have the resources or the knowledge or the staff to actually run them effectively. And if the vCISO that they contract with is more about getting the tools in and less about effectively running the tools, then it would seem to me that you've actually compounded the problem right there.
Yeah, you've ended up saddling the organization with some reoccurring OpEx expense that isn't really providing the coverage they need because you don't have the staff there to operate it. And you talked about the experience versus the pro of bringing in an experienced cyber leader who has built programs and dealt with crises. Is you get that experience. The worst thing that can happen with any CISO is you have an incident, and experienced CISOs have been through these and they know what to do. You've been through building programs. You've been through having a key staff member come and say, Greg, I got to tell you, I got recruited by a big firm and they're offering me 50% more. And I'd love to stay, but you know how it is. I got to go. And you know how to deal with those crises, and you have a plan for them ahead of time. And that's where the experience of leadership comes in versus the experience of sales from some of the vCISOs.
How can, from your experience, how can a small mid-sized business that is looking for a virtual CISO, or I guess maybe any sort of cyber security consulting, what can they do to vet, to make sure that they're getting actually what they need as opposed to what the respondents are saying that they need?
I think they should look at the history of the person and say, have they built a program that's been effective, or multiple programs? Have they led teams and grown teams? Have they been through, if you're planning potentially a merger and acquisition, that's why you're bringing somebody on. Have they been through this? Do they have that experience? But I also think that anytime you're bringing on a virtual resource, is that from the start you should have an exit plan and say, when we hit these metrics, we know it's time to exit. And I've worked with virtual CISOs who have said, like, here's where I exit, here's where you have to start finding a replacement. I help you find that replacement that fits your organization based upon what I know. Because while some engagements can run on for years, I don't think a lot of virtual CISOs are looking to stay on for 10 years as a virtual CISO. They tend to come in to do a job, get things to a point of stability and handoff, and then they move on to the next challenge.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I tell folks that my goal for all clients we work with, and some clients can be long term, and some organizations actually like that, but in the long run, our goal is to work ourselves out of a job. We want to build the organization security program to a point where they can eventually then hire somebody in, or at the very least kind of extract ourselves to a minimal retaining type consulting. Because usually when we start, we're starting almost from scratch. Well, there's two, now that I think about it from this conversation, there's two ways that we actually start. The first one is from almost scratch, and either they've been hit with something, or they're hit with some sort of compliance that they need to reach to, and then we help build the program that'll help them reach compliance, security first, not compliance. But also, now I'm forgetting what the second one was that I was going to talk about. I totally blanked out on that. But the end goal, again, is to get to that point where they can actually have an actionable security program and continue to grow their business that way. I really enjoy some of the insight that you've given there, because, again, I try to frame it sometimes when I'm talking with prospects and clients and folks here on the podcast in the 3-line of defense model, where in particular separating operational IT security as first line and risk management, which is where the CISO would fall in as second line, that you definitely want to keep those separate. So I'm not saying that an MSP cannot provide that, but I think that that's also one thing that they need to look for as far as a virtual CISO service goes.
Yeah, one of the things I used to do with pen testers is I would often, when I was in healthcare, we had a lot of healthcare specific pen testers who would pitch to us, and I would tell them all the same thing: is that, hey, I've never worked with you before, and that's actually a good thing, because I require that my pen testers not have been in the environment for 2 years, and after you do a pen test, we won't do any other business with you for 2 years. And it was interesting in that about half of them then backed out and said, we weren't interested in writing a statement of work for you guys, because their plan was to do the work and then stay there and continually bill. So I think if you're bringing in a vCISO and their sole business is CISO advisory services, you're probably in a much better spot than going with a VAR whose real business is selling products and other services.
Yeah. Well, I still see it as an evolving field. It was interesting. You go about 5 or 6 years ago, and most of the folks that seem to be in the vCISO world, or CISO, I mean, I'll say it anyway, they seem to be folks that were actually taking that experience. But then somewhere along the line, I think to your point, MSPs and service organizations seem to say, hey, we can provide that, and that's a cash flow for us, and can provide a way in for selling. So interesting. Any other thoughts on the virtual CISO world? I'm fascinated by all this. I could talk about this for an hour. So
I think some of the growth you talked about with the MSSPs is probably going to start to drop off here soon, because we're going to see more organizations say, I need that dedicated leadership in-house.
mm-hmm.
And as we start to develop more leaders and they spread out from organizations, I think the demand for vCISOs is going to go to that more niche market, where we had something really bad go on. We need somebody who can come in and appease regulators or opposing counsel. And it's going to go to the MSSPs fading off, and then the dedicated experienced professionals will probably end up staying where they're at as far as the amount of work or picking some up.
Yeah, I'd actually like to see like the separation along those lines as well too, where the MSSPs can definitely provide some excellent advisory services on the cyber side, but not so much maybe on the risk side, and continue down that path as well. Well, what I know for me, um, being in the vCISO world and having been in information security and IT for longer than I'd like to talk about, um, it can be very stressful, and you have to decompress. I am a big proponent of advising people to step away. You mentioned one thing you do. What as far as woodworking, but what's your go-to if you want to decompress and get away from cyber for a bit in IT?
Oh, my go-to is I have posted in my bio that I'm LinkedIn's resident bird man. Every Friday I do a Nature Friday post with photos I've shot from around the world of different nature things. It's mostly birds. So my go-to is chasing birds and rare birds and getting outside. I don't live very far from the Appalachian Trail, so I've got miles and miles of wilderness here that I can get lost in pretty quick if I want to disconnect.
Oh, that's awesome. Have you posted the one we record these on Fridays? Have you posted the one today?
Yeah, it's the first post of the morning. I usually do it right around 8 a.m. The post today was kind of going outside birds. I went to reptiles with a boom slang, which is a snake in South Africa. It translates to tree snake.
Huh.
Kind of wasn't expecting to see it where I saw it or when I saw it, but had the camera at the ready with a nice long lens to stay at a safe distance and got a cool shot of a pretty unique snake.
That's awesome. That's one of the reasons why I love asking this question, because there are so many different answers. I've had MMA fighters before. I've had pilots. I've had readers. I don't think I've had a bird photographer chasing snakes before. So, what are your future plans? You're going to expand your bird watch to more than one day a week, or posting, or what are your future career plans?
Oh, the future career plans. When you work in a nonprofit, it's different than working in a Fortune 500 that's publicly traded.
Mm-hmm.
And nonprofits, the mission is very clear. The mission is a multi-year mission versus a quarterly mission. And I probably will find myself back in a nonprofit situation again. Um, and I really enjoyed the engineering and operations side because you could prevent incidents instead of responding to them in the engineering and ops side. And I will probably end up taking a lot of what I've learned from the finance world and moving that back at some point to the nonprofit world.
That's awesome. Love the idea of serving. I always say that if you have a heart of a servant, you will always be successful. Derek, thank you so much for taking a few minutes out of your time today on this Friday. I will, of course, this will be out on a Tuesday, so I don't want to confuse anybody listening, but I would definitely encourage everyone to check out the bird postings. I'm going to do that right after this. And thank you so much again for your time.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, Greg.
All right, everybody, stay secure.